Back last year, I discovered a game called Phasmophobia with my friends. It was absolutely terrifying. For those not in the know, the premise of Phasmophobia involves entering a haunted residence of some kind, locating the specific room the ghost inhabits, and identifying the precise type of ghost. As you do so, your team's sanity will decrease, and once it's below a certain threshold, the ghost will begin hunting. Depending on your difficulty level, the ghost will hunt for a specified period, kill at least one of you, and then stop for a refractory period short enough to rival my childhood pet rabbit Ricky, who destroyed every teddy he could get his mitts on. Creeping through the obliterating silence of an empty house, prison, or schoolyard was, to put it bluntly, crippling in its intensity. Even at the smallest map, Tanglewood Drive, it was at least 3 games before they'd get me through the front door, and even then I would stand terrified in the foyer with a flashlight and jelly legs, backing just enough back over the threshold that when the ghost hunted, it wasn't me who was trapped inside with it. I can't put into words how scary that game was, and the rush was spectacular. There were times we'd be pressed up against the locked property door from the inside, trying to yank it open as the ghost crawled over to us, creaking like that girl from The Grudge, lights flashing around us. Someone would drop dead and we'd collapse out onto the icy coldness of Bleasdale farmhouse in a desperate sigh of relief. We guessed absolutely no ghosts correctly, and when I say this was the most fun I'd had on a game for a long time, I meant it. The thing is, we played for 100 hours, and we got very good at Phasmophobia. Eventually, we'd roll up in the van, grab our 3 permitted pieces of equipment each, and roll into whichever haunted bakery we'd been assigned to. With one person on EMF, one person holding a night vision video camera, and depending on the size of the map, one person with a parabolic microphone or some other useful location divining tool, discerning the ghost room would merely be a matter of finding the literal room. In smaller maps, we'd have the ghost room locked in the first 60 seconds. Dots, projectors, and notebooks would be set up in front of cameras so we could watch for ghostly activity from the van without needing to risk sanity and lives. Sometimes we'd walk in and have the ghost ID'd on that very first trip. Extra objectives were completed with no loss of life. We had like tens of thousands of dollars each. So what next? We experimented with difficulty settings, stuck to the bigger maps, imposed restrictions on ourselves that made figuring out the ghost 10 times harder and death 10 times more likely. Yet that didn't help. That works for people who want more of a mental and teamwork challenge. We wanted more scares, and the last thing you're going to get from playing more of a horror game is scares. When I booted up the console release of Phasmophobia, I was hyped to see that I had forgotten most of the mechanics of the game. I was really excited, yet walking through the ghostly sights with my new squad, my absolute calm calmed the rest of my team. No one camped on the threshold of the houses, no one was too scared to go inside. Hunting ghosts was met with tired acknowledgements. Me? One teammate gasped as they were flung out of a closet and strangled to death, not so much terrified at their incoming fate, but rather exasperated that they, of all people, had been sniffed out by the ghost first. And before I go any further, I don't want you to think this video is a slight on Phasmophobia by any means. You won't know this off the face of this video alone, but Phasmophobia is easily one of my top 10 games of all time. It's one of the best, most unique, and most fun games I've ever played. If I was to review the game at face value, this video would sound a lot different. But rather, I wanted to write this more as a think aloud piece for the concept of go-again gameplay in horror, a relatively new and unexplored niche of gaming that I'd like to discuss today. When I say go-again games, I'm referring to games with no set story or structure. Rather, these games are a series of matches or re-rolls, and the start, middle, and end of each game is contained fully in those, 20-minute experiences. Think Overwatch, or FIFA, or Dead by Daylight, or Smite, or Mario Kart. Games designed to be replayed over and over again because 90% plus of the game's appeal and focus is raw gameplay. There's very little story assigned to those kinds of games that isn't tucked away in character descriptions. All of the fun to be had is found in the raw mechanics, and while winning or losing will affect an individual's experience, it's more about the gameplay. Extra characters, perks, and maps are provided to extend the longevity of the gameplay. Overwatch, for example, is a game I have an easy 2,000 hours in, and that's because every character and every category of character plays like an entirely different game. Playing support on the fairly passive Mercy is wildly opposed to charging an enemy team as the beefy Ramatra. Even if you lose every match, the pleasure in playing Overwatch is found within mastering characters, picking favourites, and seeing improvement. The same can be said for Dead by Daylight, where survivors have access to a plethora of perks to approach each game from a different perspective. Since some perks aid healing and unhooks, and some perks aid chasers, and some perks aid fucking your teammates over, every member of the squad will have a different implicit role to fill and master without being confined to strict literal in-game roles. Every killer is flat out different, offering an entirely different toolkit from which to pursue your set of assigned survivors. Will you play the Hag, whose ability allows her to be anywhere at any time with a few careful placements of her signs? Will you play the Cruel Pyramid Head, the oppressive maintain my power or die Pinhead, the I am so alone please love me twins? Again, even if you never escape a trial or never get a kill, Dead by Daylight's replay value is all about the constant mashup of a million different traits. Every match is different. The rush is in the fight for escape or the fight for domination, despite many moving parts. Some people never get tired of these games. I once ran into a Claudette who had like 800 hours in Dead by Daylight and only like 10 trophies earned because she only played Claudette for 800 hours and she still wasn't particularly good. Often, tiring of these kinds of games comes as a result of getting frustrated with a changing meta, a fatigue brought about by an increasingly insular and entitled fanbase, or just looking around and realising that playing has become somewhat routine. You're missing out on a ton of other experiences and you'd like to try some other things for a bit. With every game I've mentioned before, there are two sources of the rush a player will get. The first one, which applies to every player, will be the uphill climb. The second one, which applies to most of the players most of the time, will be winning. I saw a guy tweet once, specific, I know, to say, when I lose, it feels like the end of the world. When I win, I don't feel anything at all. And I think that's because most of his enjoyment is now locked fully in that second half of the rush. Only the dopamine from winning matches does eventually wear off. The dopamine from playing different characters is much slower to wear away. Now, I know that Phasmophobia isn't Overwatch or Dead by Daylight or FIFA or whatever. I know that. Please. Rather, I'm separating them from their various genres, sports, party game, team shooter, whatever, and discussing them within the context of being a game intended to be played infinitely, how their mechanics encourage infinite play, and how they all work to keep people in the loop in comparison with each other. The problem with go-again horror games like Phasmophobia is that the uphill climb is fear. The part of the game that should have the greatest longevity in terms of providing exciting returns is the part of the game that wears away the fastest. When I first had ghosts hunting around me in that game, I would be so scared that I wouldn't be able to move. I would hear them walking over me and I'd still be standing there with my flashlight on. In real life, I would have covered my eyes and I would be squealing into my microphone. And then you die and you spectate in death and it's silly and goofy and then you go again. Eventually, the rush and excitement of being pursued by a murderous, vengeful spirit becomes mundane and occasionally even annoying. You've come to do a job and Ebenezer over here won't stop trying to put his fingers down your throat. It's like working mornings at a Wetherspoons as a woman in her early 20s. The reason I'd consider a game like Alien Isolation more action than horror is because of this. I feel like your primal brain grips onto that first one life because there's some weird base bit of mental chemistry that has you convinced that you will really die if you die in the game. The second you die, an entire layer of tension is lost. In some games, like Alien Isolation, this is enough to obliterate the tension entirely. Encountering the alien, broadly speaking, just becomes a mandatory checkpoint reset, outside of being able to fend it off. The horror soon wears away but is replaced by other things, other goals, other points of interest. There's more to like than just the horror. Returning to Phasmophobia, where the maps are static, the items are static, the ghost's behaviour is largely static, there's a low threshold of fear and a low threshold of growth. You're quick to adapt, eventually rushing through each map like you've clocked in at work for the day. And that's the thing with horror. The more time you spend in it and the more time you have to work around it, the less scary it is. Games like The Mortuary Assistant, whilst initially tense and uninviting, run dry of their scares after a good few hours, but encourage endless play with infinite shifts and multiple endings. There's also a trophy for embalming 100 bodies, a direct encouragement from the game to do that, which you can do either in the very boring scare-free endless mode or by actually just playing the game, although I'm aware only a fraction of people will actually go to the length of going for that achievement. I also think that Alien Isolation, for example, should be half the length it is at most, for similar reasons. 20 hours with that alien was enough to ensure it was completely neutered in my mind by the end, serving more as an occupational hazard, like a Fiat Panda rushing at you on a dark night while you're crossing the road. Horror works better in short bursts, and designing a game intended to be played forever is directly at odds with that. With, say, Overwatch, there's excitement in winning, but there's also excitement in playing well. If one fails, you will more often than not have the opposite to fall back on, and neither of these wells run especially dry when matches are inconsequential enough to be barely 15 minutes long. With Phasmophobia, one source of that dopamine rush is run into the ground within 20 hours, leaving us with the rush of winning. The challenge of Phasmophobia is debatable in its execution, being that there's never any variety in gameplay, and your only source of improvement as a player is in getting better and more efficient at recognizing ghostly activity and handling ghostly hunting. Higher difficulties mean longer hunts, multiple kills per hunts, shorter cooldowns between hunts, and fewer pieces of evidence to find to identify the ghost. While there are plenty of adjustments to make, you'll notice that these difficulties don't actually impose any variety on gameplay. In games like Overwatch, you can't control the map you spawn on, the teammates you spawn with, or how they play. Games like FIFA are the opposite. You'll always be on the same map, so to speak, but the composition of your team versus the massive variety and potential composition you'll play against means you're never playing the same game. Team composition is absolutely fluid. In Phasmophobia, unless you select random as your map choice, you have total control over all of these things. The only variable factor in a Phasmophobia game is the ghost, but the very backbone of gameplay means that this is extremely limited. Since the whole point of the game revolves around discovering which ghost it is, Phasmo can't exactly impose entirely different approaches depending on the ghost type. So while that is a variable, it will only change minor details, and those minor details are often key in discerning the ghost rather than playing around it. Like, a ghost orb is a ghost orb, there's not much to build off beyond that. So, What the fuck am I talking about? And that's a good question. I wrote this script on a whim one random Wednesday morning because the idea came to me the moment I opened my eyes, and after drinking a coffee and having a little breakfast sandwich, I had to sit back and really take a moment to consider what the point of this video is. What I'm trying to ask today is whether Phasmophobia works within this specific structure. With one half of its appeal long since dead, to me, I find that it's a game you can only get bored of. Games like Phasmophobia allow you to gorge yourself on them until their well is run dry, and the experience you return to will only ever be a ghost of the one you remember. You'll never regain fear or tension compared to, say, Dead by Daylight, where you can rekindle a love for the hunt. Even if you put it down for a year, you'll never be camping the threshold of Tanglewood again. There will always be a mundanity to it compared to other games of similar frameworks where there's always more to learn and do. I think that the risk of a game like Phasmophobia is that it's extremely difficult to leave on a happy note. Phasmophobia is fun and inoffensive, so I don't think you'll ever leave it on a sour note. You'll always have improved, you'll always be somehow competent, but the issue with Phasmophobia is that it gives so much to you that you will eventually find yourself dissatisfied by it. The rush of fear dissipates, leaving a rush of growth, which also has a surprisingly low skill ceiling. 100 hours in most games is significant, but 100 hours in a game intended for constant returning endless play is extremely low, and it's important to recognise that this is the aim for these essentially live service games. Games like these that are designed to be played forever see a great amount of resources afforded to maintaining and updating them, and Phasmophobia is no exception. Only while many similar games grow over time with new DLCs, season passes, game modes, heroes, maps and all sorts, Phasmophobia, at its current trajectory of development and from what I can see on the roadmap for the future, is only going to shrink as players get what they can get from it and then move on. And the recent console release and upcoming roadmap do imply an intention to keep maintaining Phasmophobia, similar to other Play Me Forever games. It's widely held that horror is best in short bursts because the more time you spend with something, the less scary it is. That's why PT is one of the most mourned gaming experiences in history. It's so short. I can't help but wonder if Phasmophobia would have thrived better as a shorter, self-contained game, maybe a series of missions that get incrementally more difficult, and an extra free play mode for the diehards who want to play it as a party game and get their fix. Because while it's good that Phasmo is a game you seldom see people hate, it is a tragedy to get bored of it. Sometimes it is better to miss something and want more of it than it is to become tired of it.